Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to my review of the Antec DP301M, a micro ATX tempered glass side paneled RGB LED fronted budget case for someone. We're going to work out exactly how well it performs, what it's like to build in, all the pros and cons, and it's about, I got this one down to 20 minutes, minus the intro and then the end part as well, so I'm pretty happy with that. But I've got all the information as densely packed as I possibly can at this stage. I'm still optimizing that. If you want to skip to any particular part of the video, I've actually organized this video into more sort of topics and categories. So in the video description and the first pinned comment are the timestamps as usual, only it's more like this is the fans part, so you can see where all the fans can go. And this is the power supply unit part, where all power supply unit features are going to be discussed, sort of thing. So I hope you appreciate that, and if you do like it, please let me know, and I'll see if I can more optimize that and record to do that better in the future. There's the chronological order of this video is a bit all over the place, but the information's there. So head towards the back of the video for the testing and that sort of stuff, all the results from there. Pretty comprehensive, a pretty big breakdown, and you'll get that information there. And at the end, I'll do a quick roundup and wrap up of my impressions or my time with the case. I've had a fair amount of time with this case due to other reasons I may explain later on, and yeah, and some miscellaneous issues I came across during and towards the end, and sort of just working with the thing overall every day. So thanks for checking this one out. If you want to pick this case up, please head to the Amazon affiliate links in the video description. It helps the channel out, and I will catch you in a second for the main and at the end for the conclusion. Packaging first, there's nothing special to report here, just cardboard, expanded polystyrene and a plastic bag, so let's move on to an external overview. Right off the bat, I think this case is a bit of a looker, and that along with the micro ATX form factor and tempered glass was enough of a reason for me to check it out. Now, that's not the way that I go about buying a case. This front intake surface area is enough to give me the chills, and ironically not the case at a glance. But it's this kind of feature that we're going to examine and work out if it ruins the case. But before we get there, we've got some work to do. Accompanying the front intake sections are a couple of diffused LED strips that can be hardware controlled via the top I/O mode switch. They look clean and add a subtle ambient glow when they're on. Up top, as part of the front panel, is the front I/O section with a power button, LED mode cycling switch, a couple of USB 3.0 ports, mic and headphone jacks, and a reset button and drive activity LED indicator. When removing the front panel with a swift pull, the I/O cables tied into the case as they are now, or will likely be in the finished build, hold the panel onto the case. This would be a big inconvenience if it wasn't for the cables being routed through the side of the front of the chassis. Offset to the side allows them to act as a hinge, providing access to your front fans and included front filter, preventing the need to undo all your future cable management work. Next up, the tempered glass panel mentioned earlier. It has a dark tint, so you won't see a lot of the small details of your system without some internal lighting. It's held in place with a well-knurled thumb screw to each corner, and a really nice detail is the protruding edge to the rear and top of the case that encapsulates the panel. To the underside, you can find a notch that's been cut out to expose the underside of the panel. So when you're removing it from the case, we'll cover that defect I came across in a second. After removing the 4 thumb screws, that notch can be called upon to both grip and support the removal of the panel. A very clean approach, and one I'd like to see replicated in the future. Back to that defect, if you take a look at the replacement and removal of this panel and compare and contrast the top front corner and the bottom front corner grommets, you'll notice the bottom front one is recessed. I thought this was some sort of shipping damage at first, but it's not, and highlights a small industrial design problem that I go into more detail about on Patreon. To summarize, if we go over the chassis assembly at each corner quickly, you'll notice that every corner apart from the bottom left, the chassis side rail is designed to and manufactured to slide underneath the top or bottom rail. However, during the assembly process on this case, the side rail to the bottom right corner was positioned to match the other bottom corner, having the side rail slide over the bottom rail. Sure, we could blame the assembler, but I don't want to moan at somebody likely working in China, working a tougher job than I am. I prefer to moan at the designer who created an asymmetrical design. One rule to rule them all, I say, and there's no need to have an off rule for one section if it could follow with the same philosophy throughout the whole case. If Silverstone could have the PS15 manufactured in the more optimal manner, one rule to rule them all, so could Antec. This is by definition poor industrial design. Moving on to the steel side panel, there's not a huge amount to note. There's no cable management relief bulge to note or any other visual feature. But I think it's worth noting that the retention of this panel relies on a linear front hook instead of the several hooks top and bottom found in many cases on the market. I prefer this approach since you don't have to fiddle around with perfectly aligning 6 hooks when returning the panel, just one to the front and pushing the panel back in place held in by a couple of screws. Heading around to the back, like the side panel, there's nothing really special to see here. We have a lower power supply unit section, mid-PCI Express slot cover section with a tidy but fiddly cover plate, and an upper motherboard I/O and a 120mm fan position. More on the fans in the fan section of the video. To round off the external overview, the base of the case reveals a smorgasbord of internal drive mounting options to the front, and the rear houses a simple rear access removable power supply unit filter, all of which is surrounded by 4 plastic feet with rubber pads. Moving on to fan and radiator compatibility, the front has quite a lot to offer, but bear in mind the size of the front intake while we're running through the options. Option 1 is a couple of 140mm fans with an optional 280mm radiator. Option 2 is a set of 3 120mm fans, but there's not enough room for a 360mm radiator unless it's less than 375mm long. And even then, there will be some specific tolerances to each end of the radiator which you'll need to measure on a case-by-case basis. In other words, to truly understand the edge case scenarios of a 360mm radiator, you will need to buy this case and radiator that you want and figure it all out yourself. It's not something I'll be able to help you with. I'll be using 3 120mm intakes as a testing scenario later, but it's worth noting that this case doesn't include protrusions in the fan screw slots. This means that some fan blades, especially with faster fans, may travel outside of their frame by a small amount. So with a flat frame to the front, such as the front of this chassis, there's a risk of a high-speed fan that will travel slightly outside of its frame and obliterate itself. And yes, that is a thing, and it happened to one of my 140mm fans in a flat-fronted chassis. So I wholeheartedly recommend adding a couple or a few rubber washers between the frame and the chassis to account for that extra travel. As seen earlier, the rear of the case has the only pre-installed 120mm fan, which I've had running at 1080 RPM, so we're talking 1200 RPM plus or minus 10%, and we'll run through how this fan performs later by itself, but you can of course add a 120mm AIO in here too, if you fancy it. And last but not least, the top fan slots, which like the front are covered with a magnetically applied filter. Up here you can throw in a couple of 120mm fans or a couple of 140mm fans, but they can't be accompanied with equivalent radiators due to the distance between the top of the chassis and the motherboard. You'll also notice here that these fan slots have recesses, which aren't all that helpful for fan blade clash prevention since these would realistically be used as exhausts, but these recesses are present here to allow the screw heads of the fans to sit neatly below the flexible filter above. I'll be testing with a single rear 120mm exhaust fan up here. Top front exhausts aren't very useful, and intakes up top heavily disrupt GPU temperatures in most cases while offering little to no benefit to CPU temperatures. When we test with all these fans later, they'll be controlled with an NZXT grid to the rear of the case. Backtracking a little in the chronological order of the build now, let's talk motherboards. By default there's a good number of pre-installed standoffs, but none of them of the very handy standoff posts that I like to see. Since this is a micro ATX case, it can naturally hold a micro ATX board of any size, and ITX boards. Hooking up all the power connectors to the board is a bit of a faff. There's not a lot of space between the top of the case and a large CPU cooler like the Scythe Mugen 5 here, so it's worth leaving the installation of the heatsink until after the CPU power connectors are in, but you can add all of the mounting hardware in prior to the installation of the motherboard in most cases for ease of access. At least this allows me to present to you the application of the MX4 thermal paste, which has been kindly supplied by Arctic. I always use too much since it decreases the chance of poor coverage, which would lead to bad thermal results. Onto the power supply unit, this case can support a very average 160mm ATX power supply unit, about as much as you can expect from a reasonably sized micro ATX case. As you can see from my installation of a 140mm long power supply unit courtesy of Silverstone, I had to remove the drive cage to get it in. Sure, you could increase the size of the power supply unit to 160mm, but you might have to compromise on the position of the drive cage, especially if you've got some stiff cables out of your power supply unit, and with that, the thickness of the front radiator, if you were planning on having one. Drives, we'll start off with the 2.5-inch options. Without the drive cage, you can throw in a couple of 2.5-inch drives in the base, great for those who want the extra space for cable management and don't need the 3.5-inch drive cage. But you'll want to make sure you can either have a SATA power cable from your power supply unit that can tuck up against the base of the case, like the one on the left, or get some sort of SATA power cable extender, like the example on the right, to compensate for awkward power supply unit SATA connectors. Or if you need to or want to retain the drive cage, you can use the dedicated 2.5-inch drive sleds. They're smartly fixed to the motherboard tray with a single screw, and as you'd expect, mounting drives to them is easy. They even have side screw holes if, let's say, you're using a drive which has some ruined screw threads, such as my old Kingston drive here. These sleds are replaced as easily as they're removed, but the side sled doesn't have gravity as well on its side as the top one, so keep an eye on it during its replacement, and both of these drives face inwards for a sensible approach to cable management. 3.5-inch drives, we do have a drive cage for those, but by removing it, like with the 2.5-inch drives, you can use the base of the case to store a single 3.5-inch drive, but again you'll want to either use an extender or end power connector to get past base clearance situations. Replacing the drive cage gives you a few options. Having it close to the front gives you more power supply unit and cable management space to the rear, and closer to the rear gives you up to 65mm of space to the front for a fan or radiator or radiator. The drive sleds can take 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives, or two 2.5-inch drives in each sled perhaps if you get yourself a bracket. They're a bit fiddly to get 3.5-inch drives into, but once they're in, slotting them into the cage is nice and easy, and although the front looks like they're a little blocked off, they don't disturb SATA connectors, so it's good to go. Graphics card installation. First off, this panel annoys me. You can live with it and it'll probably only annoy you once or twice, but I've removed the screws first and then moved the panel and the other way around like you see here, and either way it just seems to be in the way a bit. Anyway, the covers are off so the card can go in. You can go up to a 360mm card in here, minus any fans and radiators you throw in up front. The test system uses a GTX 1070 running at 2000 MHz, which takes a couple of 8-pin VGA connectors, and heading around the back, the panel can awkwardly be replaced. I wanted to touch on cable management separately since it's a big part of what makes a case function. The power supply unit shroud has a few slots towards the motherboard tray, useful for micro ATX motherboards, and the motherboard tray itself is a bit of a mishmash. There's plenty of space to route cables through, and a few slots that aren't labelled in the manual, probably for system integrators to use for graphics cards or something. There's also a good smattering of cable management loops, good for zip or twist ties, but not for Velcro straps, which I prefer. Overall, there's not a lot to complain about here, but as with so many cases, I'd like to see a deeper rear compartment to allow for cables that are thick, inflexible, or just very long and unwieldy. User manual and accessories. I left this towards the end because who really cares that much? For the sake of completeness, we have a load of screws for the motherboard and 2.5-inch drives, some power supply unit screws, a couple of extra standoffs in addition to the pre-installed ones, and some zip ties. I'm looking forward to an alternative mainstream case strap like Velcro ones to replace one-use zip ties. The manual is decent, but doesn't do a great job of representing the position of having 3 front fans. They will cover the hole to the top of the front panel, and if I were to be nitpicky, which I do all the time, this is a very low level detail power supply unit compared to the fans and the case, and the proposed screws don't line up with the holes in the power supply unit. On to final assembly. Since the cables from the front I/O go through the side of the case, it keeps them free of the front fans, and with the filter in place, the panel snaps back on easily enough. The steel side panel went on really easily thanks to the lack of hooks to the top and bottom, and the cable management options came together well considering there's enough cables in here to support the main system and 4 SATA drives with a grid to control all the fans. And last but not least, the tempered glass side panel. There'll be at least one person who wants to complain about the tempered glass in the comments, and hopefully this stops them. Whether it's glass, steel or plastic, it's not going to help thermal since it's a side panel with no ventilation options. And glass just looks so much better than plastic, so there we go. Oh yeah, turns out there's a protective film to both sides of the tempered glass. Fair play, that's going further than most other companies, but I really don't see the point. So let's get on with the test results, but first it's worth revising the setups being tested. First setup is the stock full speed setup, which uses just the fans that come with the case, the DP301M having a single rear fan that spins up to 1080 RPM, at least in my case. We'll spin it up to full speed and see how the case performs. Second setup, I'll remove the stock fan and throw in a pile of 2200 RPM 120mm fans into useful positions. For this case, we're going for 3 120mm intakes and a rear 120mm exhaust with a top 120mm exhaust. These will be spun up until the noise of the case reaches 36.5 dBA, measured at 40 centimeters away at a 45-degree angle from the front of the case. And the third and final setup takes all the fans from the second setup and spins them up to full speed just to see how much performance can be squeezed out of the case, and at what cost acoustically speaking. The CPU cooler and graphics card fans run at fixed speeds throughout, and I'll get into how it's all set up specifically in a future video, which I've been meaning to get round to for ages, since it'll take a good few minutes to explain it all here with everything else. So the only changing speeds are the speeds of the case fans to reflect the performance of the case's cooling capacity. So let's get into the 4 benchmark results. First up is Prime95 and Kombustor. This is an assault on the CPU and GPU to see how bad temperatures can get. Starting with the stock fan at full speed, compared to the ITX LDO3 and the ATX Neo Air, the DP301M has a similar CPU temperature, but the GPU suffers even compared to the poorly ventilated GPU in the LDO3. Checking out the general cooling stats of this setup, we find the single rear fan of the DP301M is as slow as you can expect a fan to be, and due to the closed off nature of the case, it is quieter than the rest of the cases, but as we saw, it's also quite a lot hotter. Changing over to the second setup with the case packed full of fans but acoustically limited to the 36.5 dBA target, we've lost 9 degrees Celsius on the GPU temperature, which is great, but only a couple of degrees off the CPU temperature. What's fascinating is the DP301M now has a better GPU temperature than even the heavily ventilated Neo Air. This could be down to the additional fan maintaining front to back airflow throughout the case, preventing internal air recycling. I mean, if all the air is being moved, there's nowhere for the hot air to stagnate. Cooling setup wise, all the case fans are spinning at roughly half speed to hit the 36.5 dBA target, very similar to the very closed off LDO3. And on to the third and final setup, spinning all those fans up to full speed, here we see the DP301M perform worse than the highly ventilated Neo Air. The DP301M is actually performing worse for the GPU by nearly 2 degrees than the acoustically limited testing. It's about 5 degrees Celsius better for the CPU, but something fishy is going on with the GPU. Perhaps a lot of turbulence is happening inside the front panel due to the limited intake surface area, but short of removing the front grille and filter, there's not a lot I can do to confirm this. And of course, with 5 fans spinning at 2200 RPM, it is very loud, but not as loud as the 4 fans in the Neo Air, which is a very highly ventilated case and is kind of expected. So with a detailed analysis out of the way, let's run through a few more reasonable benchmarks. Cinebench R20 gives us a good example of a heavy CPU load application like a render. With the stock fan, the DP301M is just a single degree hotter than the Neo Air, which has twice as many fans and a fully ventilated front panel. Fans being at the front on the Neo Air with no fans to the rear, so maybe that's something to keep in mind. The acoustically limited test basically took nearly 1.5 degrees Celsius off the temperature of the DP301M, and ramping all the fans up to full speed takes nearly 3 more degrees off the CPU in the DP301M, which is enough to help out with a slightly higher overclock to save a touch more time on a render. Changing pace to a GPU-dependent benchmark, Unigine Superposition further reveals the poor stock performance of this case for graphics cards. That single rear fan adds 7 degrees Celsius to the CPU thermals compared to a well-ventilated case like the Neo Air. that 7 degrees Celsius is enough to impact the clock speed of your GPU, although I'm surprised there wasn't a lower clock speed for the DP301M here, but that's how the result averaged out, so there we go. Adding some fans with the Acoustically Limited testing noticeably reduces the temperatures by 4 degrees Celsius. I think the lack of an intake fan at the front with the stock setup really hurts the performance of the system, so consider getting a front intake fan if you're looking to get this case, especially for a gaming load. Spinning those fans up to full speed knocks a further few degrees off the GPU temperatures. And last but not least, we have the Hitman benchmark. This provides a good balance of CPU and GPU load. And as seen before, we're looking at a good 5 degrees Celsius higher temperatures on the GPU with the DP301M compared to both a well and poorly ventilated case such as the Neo Air and LDO3 respectively. The temperatures are normalized with the addition of the acoustically limited fans, reinforcing the lack of balanced airflow with the stock setup, and picking up the speed of the fans takes a couple of degrees off the temperatures pretty much all round. So to no surprise, if you're really into this case and you want to get the best performance out of it, adding 1 or 2 fans to the front to balance out the airflow will get you close to peak airflow performance. But this isn't a high performance case, and as with most cases, you'll get a better experience probably by removing the front filter, as long as you keep on top of the dust every now and then. Oh, I seriously don't know how to YouTube video. Right, there was a couple of things I missed out, which I did intend to add in, but yeah, for the sake of saving time on my part, I'm just going to run over these things very quickly before I get into the conclusion. So, LED lighting, clearly it's a big part of this case's design, hence why it's had, some dev time put into it. It has a couple of diffusing bars and that sort of stuff put in. So I want to go over just some of the looks that you can achieve with the LED lighting there. You've got all sorts of mixes and matches of colors. You have rainbow effects. You have, say, purple and white, blue and white, that sort of effects that run through. You have static colors, fading colors, colors that fade into different colors, and they're all controlled by the mode button at the top of the front panel, along with the rest of the front I/O. So I just wanted to cover that sort of stuff. I could have made it into a little B-roll segment, but frankly, it's really not worth it. It's just a little bit of an explanation of what you can get out of the LED lighting. So that's pretty much the last couple of shots you'll actually see of my old room. So that's that. I also found the top USB ports really quite stiff. Pulled out a wireless adapter, wireless card, and yeah, I lifted the whole case with an entirely built system inside. So that was a bit odd. Also, along with the damage that was done by the sort of incorrect assembly, there was the end of a rivet that looked like was stuck inside one of the fan slots, and I thought I'd pick that up as well. I should have collected all this into the sort of conclusion segment in a second, but my head's all over the place, moving house, kind of a little bit ill. Winter just catches me every year. But anyway, on to the conclusion. So there we have it. We'll do a quick conclusion of the case. I'll move on to their miscellaneous stuff with the channel and why I haven't uploaded in like 50 days, and that will stop. But okay, on to the case first. I like the case. I actually really do. It's one of those things I want to get out off the bat of the conclusion. This case, just because it performed thermally worse than other cases in many different scenarios, doesn't mean it's an all-round failure of a case. I would say if you're going for something like a CPU that is lower than 90 watts, like the traditional 65 watt TDP range, you won't be overclocking, or maybe doing a mild overclock, but around that area, the 65 watt range, and with a slight overclock, pretty much any case will do, unless it's the most sealed off thing you can possibly think of. Then any case will do. So if you're looking at sort of lower end to mid end CPUs around the 65 watt parts, mild overclocks, nothing crazy, this will probably be fine. Same for the GPU. If you're going for nothing crazy, maybe a 2060, maybe 2060 Super kind of area, and lower. So if you're looking at a 1050 Ti, that sort of stuff, again, in this case, probably completely fine. I might say go for a front fan anyway, around the lower section to help the GPU. The CPU seems to be fine regardless. that's kind of my advice on that side of things. But that off the bat, thermally, because it performs thermally worse than another case, doesn't mean it's a completely lost cause. In terms of upgradability paths and stuff like this, obviously there's a lot of room for a big CPU cooler, big graphics card. Obviously it's micro ATX, so you could get 2, but these days that's kind of dead. There's plenty of space for storage, so expandability in that area is good. Fan placements, you obviously have the support for the radiator up in the front, not top, and adding with that, the cabling for the front I/O, it has a hinge style effect, so you don't have the issue like you did in the Silverstone PS15 where the front I/O cables pass through the top, or they're at least intended to pass through the top and then down, where you'd have to, I don't know, lift it out at a weird angle and kind of have to undo a lot of your work, because there's a lot of spare cable left over here. You can hinge it open really easily. That's a really awesome design feature. If there's going to be this kind of front I/O attached to the front plate or the front panel, then yeah, having that kind of feature is something maybe to look out for if you're looking at something like that. Ideally, like the Metallic Gear Neo G Air that I reviewed last, they completely separate the I/O, or the front I/O, the top I/O from the panel, and that's the ideal, but that doesn't normally happen with more budget cases like this one. Cable management, pretty easy, loads of space around. Go for a smaller power supply unit. There's not really a major need if you're going for more of a budget build to go for anything above 140mm. 160 is pretty traditional. If you move that drive cage forward and you're not going for a radiator, which you probably wouldn't have to, and I wouldn't really advise in most cases unless you're going for a really extreme build, then you know you don't need that front space for the radiator, just 25mm. So you can slot that drive cage forward, and probably for the time being you might not need a drive cage there, so there's a load of cable management capability in there. And yeah, overall build was absolutely fine. There wasn't standoff posts, just traditional standoffs. Can't complain about that really. It still obviously doesn't cost a huge amount for them to do, but it's workable. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Yeah, I gotta say, actually, a lot of people say they like these filters. I gotta say I don't. They just seem really flimsy. I mean, on my PS15 day-to-day runnings, I've put, like, there's a dent in there, I think, because something was sat on there for a while, and it pressed the plastic in, and it's plastically deformed it, I guess. And yeah, it just doesn't seem all that nice. They don't last very long, so having them externally, if you put anything on top of them, probably shouldn't. Doesn't last that long. There we go. I think that's pretty much all the information you could possibly need to know about this case. If I missed anything, please let me know in the comments. So on to miscellaneous crap going on with the channel. Why have I not uploaded in 50 days or so? And other things, I don't know. So first things first, I've just been pretty busy. I've been doing some other things in the background which I meant to do while getting this video out. I intended to get this one done before. I only needed about 2 or 3 days extra time, like spare time, to finish this video off, and I didn't have that spare. Moving house is something that I've done, and I'm kind of in the mid-state of doing that now. I'm still unpacking boxes and stuff. There's a whole room just full of boxes of stuff. Just about got this room together to bring the video out. It's just taken a lot of time. I didn't make the time before to be able to finish the video off before I moved, so then, you know, it's easy to have like 2 or 3 weeks of all the moving nonsense and stuff, not having computers up and available and that sort of thing, to just get eaten up. So then that's 21 days in itself completely gone, and something you just don't get back, so hence why the big delay has happened. In the background of things, if you've joined me on Discord, I'm on there sometimes. I'm on there as often as I sort of can. Lately, not very much, but I have been jumping on there. I ask a load of people for advice, which I've had huge amounts of advice of. I made a couple of videos for Patreon supporters. Not main channel content really, just stuff discussing, not anything to do with the move, but discussing some stuff to do with Premiere Elements and Premiere Pro, which one I would go with. That then inspired me to, or sort of pushed me towards getting a new platform for my system. So I'm going with an X570 board and an AM4 and a 3700X now, as advised or by some guys on the Patreon on Discord. And yeah, so I'm kind of at that state. The build hasn't been done yet. I'm still working on my old system, which has thermal issues. I think something to do with the TIM on the 6700K has just gone, maybe, perhaps, but it just spikes to 100 and then thermal throttles with a massive cooler on it, and the thermal paste is fine, so no idea. So there we go. That's probably about 4 minutes of me nattering on about nonsense, really. I'm hoping to, and I'm intending to, is my best of intentions, to get videos out on a more regular basis. This year has been basically a bit of a catastrophe. To add to all the other crap with the delays, I haven't got internet until at least January 8th, which is just ridiculous. So my sort of new network provider has not been able to get somebody. I phoned them and they said, we'll phone you tomorrow to arrange something. A week goes by, I phone them and go, well, we haven't been able to get one at an ideal moment, so we penciled in the January the 8th. It could happen before then, but maybe not. But anyway, that's that. So it is my best of intentions to pick things up into the new year. It's been a bit of a lousy year this year with all sorts of crap going on. So I'm going to hopefully change that for 2020. And yeah, I think I got just over 1 video per month done this year, which is really bad for a channel that's supposed to be growing and was growing very well. And yeah, so I kind of let that slip. So I hope I can sort that out for you guys, and I hope you enjoy many videos to come. If you have any suggestions or comments, please leave them in the... That's like a Linus Tech Tips thing. I've been watching a lot of his videos lately. Anyway, if you have any suggestions or comments, just leave them below, and I'll catch them if I can. Otherwise, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.